Here's how the format will generally go. We have a presentation, and we're going to take it in chunks, right? And then as we get to parts about building your budget, we're going to stop, and we're going to have you work on some things at your table. Sammy's going to be emailing to you, right there's Sammy. She's going to be emailing to a Google Doc. In that Google Doc, we're going to we want you to pull it up on your computer. That's where you're going to house your questions. Jeff and I will be manning those questions, and we'll be coming by to help answer them. And if there are ones that we think that more than one person has, we're going to bring them up to the whole group. And then additionally, we'll probably be able to answer some of those questions in the Google Doc. We'll save it too, because I think that they're good questions. Folks, there's even questions that we have had 25-year, 10-year superintendents ask, and they're good questions. And there are things that we're like, oh, for some reason it's just not clicking. You know, like for example, why might my state aid be going down this year? Like my budget line's okay, but my state aid's going down based on what Adam showed us. We're gonna show you why and help you understand how some of those things work. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to the bosses up at the front of the room here. And we're gonna start this process. We've never really done it like this, so extend grace, please, as we stumble through today. And I'm sure, though, that at the end of the day, you're going to come out better than what you started. And it's just really nice to have you all here. Welcome back.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. You hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. My name is Rob Leck. I'm the superintendent in Jamestown.
And I'm Brad Dick, superintendent of Underwood School District.
So as Amy said, we're going to walk through the formula today. We're going to walk through your local taxation and how that works. And some of this is going to be repeat. Some of you have seen this presentation, or probably many of you have seen this presentation before. As Amy said, we're going to break it down in chunks and try to tailor it and individualize it as much to this audience as we possibly can. So part of that is this first slide. It's a snowball activity. And so we want you should have scratch paper at your table, and we might ask for our focus group members to help in pick up those pieces of paper as people fill them out. We have 2 questions that are going to help us tailor this presentation to what you need it to be. And the first is, what am I looking forward to learning most from this session? The second piece of that is regarding school finance and budgeting. What am I most concerned about this next year? So please take some time, put that on a piece of paper. For us, that is different somewhat from what Amy talked about in sending out a Google Doc and linking specific questions. This relates to this presentation, so please take some time and help us tailor this presentation to what you need it to be. So again, what am I most looking forward to learning about in this session? And number 2, regarding school finance and budgeting, what am I most concerned about in this next session? So please take some time to fill that out on a piece of paper, and we will come and pick them up.
That I stuck in there too. Do we want to pass those
Maybe
around?
just as you fill them out, put them in a little pile in your table so we can swing by and pick them up. Focus group members, if you can help us pick those up. thanks everybody for taking the time to write those out so we can improve our presentation. We like to, because we're good teachers at heart, we want to understand what you know. And so we're going to ask you on another piece of scratch paper to answer, I think there's 8 if I remember correctly, but 8 different pre-assessment questions. If there's anything in here that you're uncertain about, we will get to throughout this presentation. We will show you all the steps to get there. So determine taxable value for a home valued at $100,000. We want you to determine how much revenue a school district with a taxable value of $50 million generates if you have a mill levy of 65. Number 3, how many mills are intended to be adjusted from your district's foundation aid and equalizing funding for school districts? And what percentage of energy production taxes are adjusted from a district's foundation aid? So we have 4 more, but those are your first 4. Just give you a moment to look through and do a little calculating. And again, if these are questions you are unsure of, that's okay. We will get to all of the steps in due course. As I was looking through some of your questions, I had a few that I saw that said I'd like to learn more about this process and how I can educate another person or how I can educate my board, or if you want this presentation at the end, just email us and we'd be happy to share this with you if this is something that you would like to make your own and help to educate your board or your teachers or whoever it is that you might want to do. I've actually used this presentation probably 50 times to different audiences over the years. I think this is year 8 that we've done this, something like that, or something similar. The next 4 questions. How many iterations of this formula have we seen in the last 15 years? Or of a state foundation aid formula have we seen in the last 15 years? What federal title program is the main avenue for most districts to provide professional development? 7, what levy is available only through a referendum for a specific amount and for the purpose of new construction? And the last of our pre-assessment questions, what is the new dollar increase limit that districts can request in their general fund in any given year? The new dollar increase, what can you ask for a new dollar?
And that one actually is a little tricky question, actually, because if you're below 60, that could change.
Yep, sure. So assuming you're at 60. Okay, so you can check your answers again. We will get to the process here. Determine the taxable value, $4,500. How much revenue? That's $3,250,000. How many mills are deducted? 60 mills. What percentage of energy production taxes? 75%. How many iterations? We've had 3. I've been a superintendent now for 18 years, and I've gone through 3 different formulas. What federal title program? Title II-A. The levy, of course, is sinking in interest. And assuming a 60 mil, your dollar increase, your new dollar increase is set at 12% in new dollars. So again, being teachers at heart, our learning targets, you're going to recognize key terms and dates associated with school finance, define the components and the state funding formula, understand the basic components of foundation aid payments, knowing that's probably the biggest reason that you're here. We all receive projections from Adam. We all know what happened in House appropriations and having that amended to 0%, and that's a scary thing to see what happens. And we do need to talk about that, what happens now that a 0% I think even legislators sometimes think that 0% means hold harmless, and that is not the case. We'll show you why why it's not a hold harmless. But that is not a hold harmless, and that's a message we need to make sure that we're talking with all of our legislators about. 0% is not hold harmless. 0% is going backwards, even in an apples-to-apples comparison. Define the elements of local funding and mill levies, calculate taxable value, mill rates, and growth cap, and then recognizing primary funding available through federal programs and how to access additional grant funding. We won't talk as much about that, but we did add some slides in here for ESSER. We have some ideas related to ESSER and how you should be thinking about budgeting towards the ESSER dollars that you receive. These are big numbers. And the ESSER conversation is really one of the reasons, and probably the most primary reason, and I'm sure Amy could talk better to this than I can, but White House approach said 1% should be 0%. It's because of these big numbers that schools are seeing related to ESSER, and they really have nothing to do with one another, and we should be thinking of them separately, but that is what it is. And I won't talk a lot about these key terms and figures, I'll just leave it up here and you can see. I'm going to talk briefly, and then I'll let Grant start. Types of federal funds, and just a review for a lot of you, you should know this information, or at least been familiarized with it in the past, but Title I, we're probably the one you're the most familiar with, provides supplemental instruction beyond the regular classroom for identified students in math and reading, of course, unless you're a school-wide title school. That might look a little bit different for you. Funding is based mostly on poverty, the number of low-income students that you have. Title II, Title IIA, mostly used for professional development, likely in your district already. There are components of reduction in class size and the ability to retain and recruit teachers and principals. Title III are English learners that support for our ELs to be English proficient. Of course, there is a component of that in our funding formula, which we'll talk about as well. Most of you likely have this funneled through your REA as part of the consortium. 4A, one of my favorites, academic enhancement grants. I think this was probably the best change that I've seen in 15 years in terms of federal programming. I love this program. I think the more money we can advocate to funnel into 4A, the better, because it's so broad. It allows us to address a lot of needs that we see. But that requires the components of a well-rounded education, supporting safe and healthy students, supporting effective use of technology. So if you're a district that is $30,000 or higher than allocation, you have to work within certain parameters of percentages. If you are below that amount, it's basically those three areas. You can spend it in any way that you wish if you're under that 30. So if you're above 30, a few hoops to jump through, but a wonderful program, something we absolutely need to advocate to continue to get dollars into. Title VI, Indian education. Title VIII, Impact Aid. If you're not familiar with Impact Aid, you would have access to Impact Aid if you have federal property that you aren't able to tax in your school district. There's compensation for that, or compensation for the increased expenditures of federally connected children, so whether that's a military base, whether that is on Indian lands. ESSER II, there is a link here to the ESSER II, those 15 different areas that you can spend ESSER guidelines, or the ESSER guidelines. I have them listed here. There are 15 of them. You should be familiar with many of them because they existed in ESSER I, even though the application process looked different. So I'll just skim through them. I won't read them word for word. And again, you can have access to it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, the ESSER II, there is a spreadsheet at the DPI website that shows exactly the allocations that they have available for your school district. So if you haven't found that, make sure you, basically the easiest way is find DPI website and you search, put ESSER II, and and that's what that link is actually DPI's webpage. And it lists out exactly the allocations that you have. The guidelines haven't been finalized yet. That will happen by the end of the session. But there is money that is available in ESSER II. Depending upon what happens at the federal level, ESSER III would generate more dollars, and so that is being talked about as well. And as Dr. Leck talked about, that's really the challenge that we have in the session, is the legislators are saying that you're getting ESSER 2, ESSER 3 potentially, you had some of the CARES money, you had all this money, why do we need to increase funding for you? And that's a challenge that we're seeing because it's different. This was different purposes. ESSER 2, ESSER 3 is not a good solution for when you go into negotiations with your teachers. Don't go down that road. And so those are some of the things that the challenges that we're seeing in this session that we'll continue to work through over the next couple months.
So I'm assuming everybody knows what their ESSER 1 allocation was, even if it does. Do you know what your ESSER 2 allocation is, or what your proposed allocation? Has anybody seen the ESSER 3 yet? Those that have seen that? So just to put it into context, it was about $32 million that came to the state for ESSER 1, about $122 million for ESSER 2, and that's about $420 million for ESSER 3. That's created the sticker shock for our legislators to say, whoa, 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 whoa. We're already in a little bit of a funding issue here in our state, and why would we need to give you 1% when you're just brimming to the top with these federal dollars? And as Brent said, you know, there's finite purposes for these dollars. You don't negotiate with ESSER, at least you shouldn't negotiate with ESSER. And so a lot of challenges here that we need to be able to articulate with our legislators. But again, these are the ESSER guidelines. These last two are game changers for you, especially if ESSER 3 comes to pass. And I will read these. School facility repairs and improvements to enable operation of schools to reduce risk of virus transmission and exposure to environmental health hazards and to support student health needs. Pretty broad topic. Inspection, 15 inspection, testing, maintenance, repair, replacement, and upgrade projects to improve indoor air quality in school facilities, including mechanical, non-mechanical, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, blah, blah. So a lot of impact here. I'm sure you're, as superintendents, thinking about all the facility needs that you likely have and how these dollars could play a big piece into those facility needs. And I would challenge you a little bit. Some of the considerations that I think we need to be thinking about for ESSER. It's great. We love that facilities piece, and that opens up a lot of different things for us. I would challenge you, though, not to be limited there. I think there's some other buckets that we should be thinking about how ESSER dollars can fit. What that looks like in your district is probably going to be different than what it looks like in my district or anybody else's. But I would challenge you to at least think about these three different categories and buckets. One, addressing new needs or continuing needs resulting from the pandemic. We know we have a 20% requirement to target dollars for what the feds have called learning loss. Okay? That might be the continuation of an instructional coach or additional staff in your district that you've had to put in place due to the pandemic. This is one of the buckets that you could think about to continuing those. You might have had greater needs for your EL students or for students in poverty, whatever it is that's impacted your district. This might be that one bucket to think about. The second one is investments that benefit your district long term. This is not a pot of dollars anybody in this room is ever going to see again. Treat it like that. Okay? Use these dollars and think about how you can make investments right now that impact your district in the long term. That could be infrastructure changes, technology changes, that could be facilities. There's lots of different avenues that could fit into this. How can I impact my district in the long term? You know, if you think about facilities, this is some indirect tax relief potentially too for your people, especially with some of the big dollars that have been coming through, or that for some districts see really pretty significant dollars and pretty significant building and facility needs. And the last, and I think one that we absolutely need to make sure that we don't forget is how can we support opportunities to innovate as educators. We know that at times cost is a barrier to moving forward with innovative ideas. Use some of these dollars, I would suggest, and at least you consider using some of these dollars for those types of projects. How can you move the bar in your district when cost has been a barrier for you? How can you, say, enhance CTE projects? I can tell you in Jamestown, with our ESSER dollars, we're starting an aviation program. We'd never be able to do that. That would never happen in Jamestown without these kinds of dollars. But this is a long-term, this is a long-term plan, and I think it's a great way to use ESSER dollars to build programs and be a little bit different than what we were before. We're aviation and drone tech. Those are the two classes that we're adding as a part of this. We're getting that started, specifically due to ESSER.
And he shared a little bit about what kind of things he's looking at, and I'll share from my perspective, because I'm in transition minimum school, and you'll see that other slides I put Underwood's information up there. But part of what I'm looking at is I do have some facility needs that kind of been pushing off, but now will be a good time because that will help money in the general fund as I transition onto the formula that I won't have to pay for in other ways. And so if we look at this opportunity the right way, it can really help us to push learning ahead, but it also might help those of us in this room, which I know most of us are in this room, that's why we're here, transition minimum school, that we know cuts are happening in our general fund, but maybe this will help find ways that we can spend money that normally we might have looked at the general fund. We got to be a little careful there. Like again, we're getting firm guidance on this, but there may be some opportunities there as well. And so that's how I'm thinking about it in my district, because I know I'm seeing cuts the next 6 years.
Well, it absolutely can help to use to balance what we know is coming, especially if we're in that 0 or maybe even at the 1% level in our state funding. We know that you're going to have to try to balance somehow. And with ESSER, think of all the different options. Like I said, what works in Jamestown is not going to work in Bismarck, is not going to work in Hillsborough, is not going to work in Grenora. You're going to have to find different, your solutions are going to be different than mine, and that's okay. But be purposeful and thoughtful about these ESSER dollars, because like I said, they're never going to come back to you again. This opportunity will never exist again in your district. So one thing, and you can look at this, we won't break it down, or we won't show you in this presentation, but just as an example, I linked in a Google Doc that I put together for a stakeholder team that we put together in Jamestown to target how to look to spend our ESSER dollars, at least to allocate our ESSER dollars. And I just broke down these 15 guidelines, allowable uses, and I asked this team to add in, and you can, if you want to, when you have this presentation, you can click on it and see the different types of activities that we put in as suggestions, and then we'll prioritize based on what those costs are and what we want to move forward with as a district. But it's a nice way, and I think you need to think about ESSER funding is not just about a decision that's made by the 1 or 2 people that are at this table. There's other individuals that should be involved in that potentially in your district. And just think bigger about how those districts, or how those dollars can help your district. So one of the things we do want you to do is we know that we learn best not necessarily from being talked at, but from having discussions. So what I would like you to do is at your table, discuss what you've already thought about for use in ESSER in your district. And just have a conversation in your table. We'll ask some that are willing to share. But we would like to know what you're planning to use ESSER dollars for in your district. So please have 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how long you need, to have that discussion about your preliminary plans for ESSER.
I'm very new.
Discussion. But who would like to share some good ideas that happened at their table? Some things that you think were really good discussions or good ideas that came up for use of ESSER. Go ahead.
I guess for us, we have weight room and cardio room, and this hasn't been discussed, so really a lot yet. But we have a weight room and a cardio room in our school. We let our community use them and stuff. And we were looking, we don't have enough classrooms, so using that money to build onto one of our gyms on the outside, putting key fobs because the community comes in, charging monthly fees, keep everything updated where we can get a good ventilation system in there because there's no ventilation systems. So get our community more involved in our school too that way. So
Great. So I know Dr. Bitts, would you be interested in talking about Mandan and what you guys are doing and how you're partnering it with your potential referendum coming up? Putting you on the spot.
No, we have a $84 million referendum we're voting in April, and our board passed the resolution, so the max we can bond for is $84 million. What we're doing is we're messaging this. We found out about the bulk of these dollars afterward. We're getting 19 million in ESSER funds. We're saying that to the extent allowable, we're going to use those money to give our taxpayers relief. In other words, if we have to set 20% aside for learning loss, the other 15% will go towards buying that down. So instead of 84 million, we'd sell 69 million if it passes. That's our plan. We got to get it approved by DPI, but that's our hope.
That's a great coupon. We can sell that to your community. I was talking about the aviation and drone technology in Jamestown. You know, one thing that I didn't mention is we're actually partnering with the University of Jamestown as well. So we're going to upfront the costs, the one-time cost of the equipment. We partnered with the University of Jamestown. They're going to provide the personnel, and we'll run it as a contracted service. They'll have access to our reimbursement rate through our CTC for those classes, and everybody wins. University of Jamestown gets free access to aviation equipment. We get access to personnel long-term. So we're going to start a new program and not ask for taxpayers for a penny in the long term, short-term or long-term. There's a lot of ways that you can use this if you think about how to access those dollars, plus our pretty active aviation community in Jamestown. They'll also have access to those simulators as well as new pilots come on board and they're able to get those hours.
When is this going to be final? I mean, that's the looming question. You have ESSER 2, they say it's ours, but then they say it's not, and then they say it's ours. ESSER 3, I know, is part of this latest stimulus package, but I mean, that's the conundrum I'm playing with is how much time do I even want to invest in this before I know?
I get it.
You know?
So yeah, I totally understand the question. If you couldn't hear Nick, the question is how much do I invest and when is it going to be final? I wish I had an answer. I wish I could tell you. My understanding is if they approve the guidelines for ESSER 2, when ESSER 3 comes, assuming that the guidelines don't change, it'll follow the same process, so we won't get hung up on ESSER 3 like we were in ESSER 2, but you know, I don't know, things at the legislature, especially when they're all together right now, seem to run at a snail's pace, and it's very frustrating for all of us. So I wish I could tell you when, and it seems like we've waited on ESSER 2 already far, far longer than we should be. But I think it makes sense to have at least a plan, and then you can get to details as it goes along.
And I did want to put something that's been on the Google Doc, and it is great to look at new staff or new programs, and that's a good idea that can really enhance education. But the caveat, and I like someone put it in parentheses, just understand that when this money goes away, then you have to start thinking about how are you going to fund them after that money goes away, or you're going to have to eliminate them or absorb them somewhere else. And so kind of a plan that way too. So I appreciate, I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. When you think about staffing, that's something to think about.
I'm going to cede a little bit here to Brant. There's probably nobody in the state of North Dakota that knows more about our state funding formula than Brant Hick. Very, very knowledgeable. I'll tell you, I've served in focus group meetings with Brant and others. You know, the speed at which, you know, people like Brant and Levi and Paul Stremick and Mark Lemire and those guys are able to process these changes, it's amazing. And I think we're very, very fortunate that Brant's here to talk about all of the changes that are potentially occurring in our state funding formula. So a great resource. I'd ask that you please really give him a lot of attention as he shares his knowledge here.
No pressure. The state funding formula, and that is something, the question that we put up there, how do we get here? That's the most common question that I get asked when I start working with school districts and talking about transition minimum. And so as I go through this, we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's really an understanding. It's good to know how we got here that makes some sense, and so as we move forward, what are some of the thoughts? So the first thing, you know, the two main concepts are adequacy and equity. There was a concept as far as, is there enough money to fund our educational systems in our school district? So we talk about adequacy, and so that's the first thought that we have. And I made sure I put this in here because I think this is important. Transition minimums were never a part of the adequacy discussion. Transition minimums came into place because of when we transitioned, Dr. Leck talked about he's been through 3 funding formulas as we transitioned to the one that we're at right now from the one before. Transition minimums and maximums, I know there's some schools here with transition maximum as well. They were put into place just to be able to get the school districts, to get the votes, to get the law passed. And they purposely used the word transition, and they didn't grandfather those dollars in. And so that's important to understand that I know over the last 6 or 7 years, some of us included, Underwood, we've gotten used to that money, and so now it's going to hurt as that money goes away. But that's not part of the adequacy discussion. And so I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. And so that was not part of that discussion. What was equity. And I like this little visual slide to show what the difference is between equality and equity. And that's what the formula that we have now, it really tries to put some things into place so that everyone can look over the fence. And I think that's important to understand that the pieces of the formula that are in place are to provide that for school districts. Now, over the past, there have been some challenges to the North Dakota School Funding Formula, and that was part of why we had the 3 iterations, because there were some legal challenges to that. One had to do with Bismarck versus the state of North Dakota, and Dr. Leck did his dissertation on this, so certainly he can add any that he wants to this, because he does this not more than I know about it. But anyway, so what was interesting is the last part of this. The North Dakota Supreme Court, by a 3-2 vote, agreed with the district court decision. However, because of our North Dakota Constitution, it requires at least 4 members of the court to declare a statute unconstitutional, since only 3 of 5 members agreed with the plaintiffs, the North Dakota School Funding Formula was allowed to continue. So even though they had a majority, because of our Constitution, it wasn't allowed to change at that point. And so that just gives a little background there. In 2003, there were 9 school districts with Williston as the lead plaintiff, and this case was based on adequacy. Those districts said we don't have enough money to fund our school districts, and so that was what the basis of their charges were. And in 2006, right before the trial, I see there's a typo there. I always missed that. How many times have we looked at this and we still missed that? Yeah. It's crazy I see that. Was scheduled to begin with the 2 sides agreed to stay in litigation and stated that it is desirable and beneficial for them, the citizens of North Dakota, to stay this act. And so they worked on, and that's how we came up with our new funding formula. So, revenue, foundation aid overview. How do you generate revenue in your funding formula? So the majority of school funding comes through the state foundation aid. And again, depending upon every school district here, you would have a different percentage of the revenue that comes from the state. And there's reason why that is, and we'll walk through that as far as where that comes about. The foundation aid formula has moved from school finance from being property-centric to student-centric. And what that means is what generates the dollars for your district is the number of students that you have. The more students you have, the more revenue is going to generate from the state. And that's a change from what the other funding formula had. That was really property centered to now student centered. And really, and I try to put in your worksheets, and I know we asked you to have your worksheets, really lines 1 through 7, and I'll have that up on the slides as well. But that's what generates the revenue for your school districts.
So remember when we had this, am I on? No. How about now? No? Okay. When 3 iterations ago, or the initial funding formula that I worked with 18 years ago, our taxable value, or our mill levy maximum was 185 mills. Substantially higher than what it is now. I mean, there was a cap on your local, that was up here. And the percentage of your state was down here. That has shifted in 3 iterations here. Now you have a lower local cap, and we are beholden to the changes that happen at the state far more than we were 18 years ago. 18 years ago, we were able to say, well, if the state gives us 0% or 1%, I can make that up locally. I might be able to generate a few more mills or ask a request for more mills, and if I was capped out, I took a greater, there was a greater impact on that taxable value increase. That's much, much more limited. And, you know, and the other piece that I think is really important to talk about with this, you know, the infographic with the equity and equality. Sometimes I hear us talk, and it's unfortunate, I hear us talk about winners and losers in the state. That's not how I want people to think about our formula. It's not about winners and losers. It's about, as Brent really put it well, making sure that everybody's able to look over the fence. Yeah, somebody's going to get a little bit more potentially than you in state aid, and that impact might be a little bit higher for your neighbor than for you. This is about making sure that every kid in North Dakota has access to an equitable, adequate education. That's what this is really about. And so I want us to stop thinking about things like winners and losers. This is about North Dakota kids and North Dakota public education.
And the last one I want to mention on this slide is it used to be that you could increase your general fund by 18%. And now it's down to 12%, other than if you were a district that is below 60 mills, because your taxable valuation has increased greatly over the years, you actually have ability to levy above the 12% to get to 60 mills, and that's a different group. And that is right now is 12%. And that is the biggest thing when I visit with legislators. That's the biggest thing we hear all the time. Well, our property, you know, we always charge too much property tax. And actually this session was the first time I heard something that made a lot of sense to me. That is reason why our patrons are concerned and I'll say concerned, that's a good word, are concerned about property tax is because they see it. Every year you get a statement, you know exactly how much money you're paying in property tax. I question any one of you to tell me exactly how much money you paid in sales taxes last year. You don't have a clue. It's hidden. I mean, we just pay it. But that's what's happening is everyone knows exactly what they're paying in property tax, but these other taxes, they're hidden. So it made sense to me. Revenue Foundation Aid, we're going to review the formula. We have a sample school district that's Underwood. I put my numbers up there because I've been transitioning in one school. We're going to talk about the first thing, average daily membership. The formula is based on the district's spring average daily membership. So the report that is due by the end of June, make sure that is accurate. That is what determines your money for the next school year is the spring average daily membership. And so that is what generates dollars. The last session we were actually able to get dollars for those that have an increase from the last spring to the fall, those districts that are growing. And we're going to talk a little bit about on-time funding. And so that is what is there. So average daily membership is lines 1 through 7 and in your worksheet, so that's what generates your dollars from the previous year. This doesn't account for any school districts, is there any growth or long-term defined enrollment. ADM is based on the total number of days that a student has been enrolled. So if your student starts the first day and goes all the way through the school year, that's going to generate 1 ADM, average daily membership. That's what you're paid for. You're paid on how long those students are part of your school district. If a student comes halfway through the school year, finishes out the year, 0.5. You might have some students that start at the beginning of the year and then move. That actually will lower your ADL at the end of the year. So make sure you understand that is what determines your payment is your average daily membership. Your average daily attendance, ADA, is the actual number of days that they're in your school. So if they're gone because they're sick, that would affect your ADA. But we're paid on our ADM, not ADA. So make sure you realize that.
Yeah, that seems pretty obvious to a lot of those of us that have been in the state for a while. But there are other states that actually their funding is based on average daily attendance, not average daily membership. So make sure to bring it up.
It's important to understand transition minimum, transition maximums, that was put into place in 2000, it was based on 2012-13 school year. It was updated, we had to reset the baseline for 2019-20, and basically that is as far as you can fall. So transition minimum are in there, whether it goes back to 12-13 or 19-20, actually everything technically goes back to 2018-19 baseline year. That's as far as you're allowed to drop right now. That's why some of you are transition minimum schools, because you've actually had a decrease in students from 2018-19. And so that's why some of you are there. Some of you are there because it goes back to 2012-13. You've had declining enrollment from that. And so that's part of the reason why you are a transition minimum school. It goes back to where you're at with students then to where you're at now. Some of it goes back to amounts of revenue you got then compared to now. So there's different reasons why transition minimum schools are there. And really the challenge that we have, and once everyone's on the formula, there won't be any other catch-all transition minimum there. And so as you lose students, basically you're going to be losing revenue. Now, what we're putting into place in 1388, there's an increase in weighting factors, which we'll talk about here as well. But the weighting factors will generate more dollars for you as well, and so we'll talk about how that works. Adjustments for in lieu taxes, that's for money that comes from your county, whether it be oil, coal, those type of things. So that can generate more dollars for you. So that's your in lieu, that's lines 3541, section B of your worksheet. So that's you can see how much money you get from there. And that creates greater equity. Again, and I had a discussion with a district just a couple weeks ago. They're out west, and they're saying, well, it sure would be nice to keep all our money. And it becomes an equity issue. Why should a district with a certain number of students, and you have a school district on the eastern side of the state, why should one district get to keep all their money and that other district have no access to any of the oil or coal money? And so that's really what's come into place with that. 75% of local money, the in lieu of, is deductible. It's basically you subtract it from your payment. That goes back. That's money that's available to be able to put onto the formula. And so that's how they make that equitable across the state.
So every step that you walk through when Brent goes through the formula line by line, everything is either a component of adequacy, making sure that we have the ability to fund an adequate education, or it's a component of equity. How are we distributing those resources across the state so everybody has access to an adequate education? Every piece is somehow connected to those two ideas, and that's integral to understanding how we fund schools.
The other adjustment that's put into place on the funding formula is your weighting factor. So again, that's an understanding that as a small school, we're not as efficient. When we have 12 to 15, that's roughly our size at our school, kids per class, we're not going to be as efficient as other schools that can fill up every class and have 22 to 25 kids. We know that. So to help with that inefficiency, we have weighting factors. And the weighting factors help generate more dollars for the smaller school districts. And that is something that is in 1388 right now. As school districts decline, the weighting factor increase will help those districts be able to continue to generate a few more dollars. We're going to walk you through the formula step by step. State payments are determined for a number of different calculations on student membership, other program membership, and formula adjustments. And so I'm going to take and walk through, and hopefully everyone of you know where to find your payment worksheet. I see a lot of them out, so that's really good. And so if you brought those, that'll be a good time to bring those up and kind of see what your numbers look like as we compare. So the very first thing that we have, and again, this is our numbers at Underwood based on my February payment. And the first thing that we have is student membership. So the student membership on your worksheet, that is determined by last spring's enrollment. So that is always something to look at as you get your worksheets and your spreadsheets from Adam Tesher from DPI. Take a look at that. Is that accurate? And his initial that he sends out that you just got in email yesterday or earlier this week, that was based on his most recent information, which would be from this last fall, your fall enrollment summary. So he uses that as his numbers. Now, that may not be accurate in your school district. You may have had some kids move in. You may have had some kids move out, depending upon where you're at. And so that is going to be adjusted. So the numbers that you get from Adam, that's the first place to look. What is your ADM going to look like? So for us, we generate PK special ed. Those are kiddos ages 3 and 4 that you provide special ed services for. And so that's the first line. Your kindergarten kids, grades 1 through 6, 7, 8, 9 through 12. Alternative high school, we don't have an alternative high school, so I don't have anything there. School districts, if you have an alternative high school, you might have some students in line number 7. So that's the first part, student membership. What students do you have at your school? The second part then is other program membership. So depending upon how many kids you have at your school is going to generate other dollars as they walk through the formula. And so the first thing that we have, line 8, alternative high school. And again, if you don't have an alternative high school, you can have 0. That's what I have under, but I don't have an alternative high school, so it's 0. If you have an alternative high school, you might have some kids in there. Line number 9, special ed ADM. Now this is depending upon what you have in up above. So line number 9 should be the exact same as if you look at line 7. Line 9 is just taking your total from line 7 and it's putting it in line 9, and that's going to determine how much extra money you get for your special ed. I had to pause a little bit as I heard a legislator say, well, every school district, your special ed kids generate federal dollars for you. There is some truth to that because that is what determines your special ed units. It's federal dollars from your special ed count, but that doesn't necessarily flow to you as an individual school district. And so there is no place in our funding formula that says if you have this many special ed kids, this is how much money you get. It's totally based upon how many total students you have. And so it might be accurate. At Underwood, it generates an extra 16 kids, 16.2 extra kids, in a sense. I can tell you we have more special ed kids than that. Just the way it is.
Well, in the science behind it, there was no science behind that weight. When the second iteration of the formula came, it was, they used it to make the dollars they wanted to spend work. That's how that weight came to pass. There isn't science behind it and say, well, special ed students or average special ed students in the state, it was just a number, arbitrary number that was picked out of the air to make the math work. And actually it was changed once. I think we got 300.
Yeah. Because it was 0.09, now it's 0.082. But that happens. That happens a lot in the legislative session. And it's not necessarily science behind it. It's like, well, how much dollars do we have? Let's do the math backwards, and let's adjust the weight. So that happens quite a bit. So that's how line 9 is your special ed. Line 10 again would match with what was above, and so it generates a few more dollars for those. Any special pre-K special ed kids generate dollars. Line 11, regional REAs. Again, it takes your total. Now it's interesting that dollar amount that generates. In a sense, you don't get that because they take it away from you and pay your REA directly, as if you're a member of an REA. But it does. This is what generates those dollars for the REAs. Line 12, so 2021 fall enrollment above 2020 ADM. This is your on-time funding. So line 12 was new this year. If you looked at your worksheets the previous year, you did not have a line 12. Your line 12 was different. Now they haven't put that in there. But this is your on-time funding. So your line 12 is the number of students above where you were at last spring to where your fall enrollment was. At Underwood, we saw an increase of 2012, 8.62. So we had 8.62 kids more than what our spring enrollment was. So that's line 12. And right now we're at 0.5 payments. So you take that times 0.5, it adds 4.31 to our average daily membership. Next year that's going to go up, right now if the bill passes 1388, that's going to go up to 0.6, then 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 until it generates a full payment. Line 13 is going to be an adjustment. And that is basically, they're going to look back and say, so for this year, nobody has anything in line 13. Next year, a lot of districts will have either a positive number or a negative number. The negative will be if you actually lost students during the year. So for us at Underwood, we gained 8.62 at the beginning of the year. Now let's say we have had a couple families move away. We might have said, well, you really should have only gotten paid for 5 extra students instead of 8. And so next year, there's going to be a negative in there. So if your number of students that were in the fall actually goes down, next year there's going to be a negative number, which is going to take some money away. If it goes up, let's say, for instance, we had 3 families move in, and now that number really should have been 15, next year we're going to have a positive number. So that's where that last session was called a clawback, and that's where that clawback is going to be. So that's going to be at wherever we're at. And so for next year, it's going to be at the 0.6 level. Next year, the year after, 0.7, 0.8, and so on and so forth. So that is where if you're growing, you're going to see an increase. If you had numbers at the beginning and then went down, you're going to see a decrease. And so those are 2 new lines that we're in this year that were not in previous years.
Brant, but if you're just declining enrollment, you're not gonna see that, right? The callback is only if you had a gain.
Yes, great point. If you're declining and you didn't have any extra students, so you didn't have anything in line 12 this year, you're not going to have a negative number. So only if you had an increase and the thought process is, well, you really shouldn't have been paid for those students because you really didn't see an increase. But if you have a decrease from the previous year, you don't have to worry about that. So yeah, that's a great point.
So another history lesson for those of us old fogies that have been around a while. It used to be this way. We used to be paid on our spring ADM or our fall enrollment, whichever was higher. And one of the arguments that you may hear or may have heard from legislators is that schools got paid for phantom students. You know, the exact reason what Brant was talking about with this adjustment that came in and we were paid on fall enrollment, it was always this way. We were always adjusted out those additional students in the fall. And I don't know where that belief came from, but that's never been the case. This is exactly what it used to be, outside of getting paid for only half of a student. And again, the history behind that is when we changed to a new funding formula, at the time, nobody was growing. Well, just West Fargo. But nobody else was growing. So it wasn't a big deal for us to all go transition to only the spring ADM. It wasn't a big deal because it didn't impact the vast majority of districts. But very quickly after that, then we started seeing growth in districts because greater people influx in the state energy sector. And so that became a much bigger deal again. So then we had to go and advocate for those schools that were seeing increased enrollment in their districts to be paid for the kids they're educating right now, again. So that's the history behind why this has come back. It might seem to lack common sense why we were only paying for those behind, but it did used to be both ways, and we're just trying to get it back.
The next 3 lines have to do with ELL, level 1, level 2, level 3. So if you have any numbers in there, that means you do have some English as language learners, level 1, 2, or 3. And so that generates some more dollars. If you don't have any students there, then those will be 0. So us at Underwood, we have 1 level 1 student. So that generates a 0.4 factor for us. Line 17, at risk, that is based on a formula, and that's grades 3 through 9, I believe, That's your free and reduced lunch generates the numbers that are populated into that line. So that is basically the understanding of the thought process. The thought process behind that is those students that are free and reduced are more at risk to dropping out. They may need a few more services, and so that's what generates some more dollars for you. So that is generated from the state. That's a little bit hard to follow sometimes exactly what that is, but for us, it's 32.79 that gets populated in that area. Line 18, home education district supervised. So if we supervise a home educated student, that goes up in this area. Summer school, or line 19, all middle school. If you have an alternative middle school, that's what that stands for. Alternative middle school, that's where that goes into your worksheet. So if you have any numbers there, that's what generates that. Line 20 is summer school. So if you have summer school, there are certain guidelines you have to follow to get to have numbers in here. You have to have so many hours and so forth. For us in Underwood, what generates our summer school program is we have driver's ed program. So we just have a few students that take driver's ed, and so that's what generates the numbers for us. Special ed extended school year, and so if you provide a special ed extended school year, that could generate some numbers in there for you. So that's line 21. Line 22 and 23 is the only thing we have in law right now for those real small districts, and that is this. If you are a school district that is between 275 or greater than 275 square miles in your school district, so if you have more than 275 square miles and you have less than 100 kids, so in other words, you're really isolated, you're out there, you get an extra 0.1. Underwood, we don't qualify, we have more than 100 kids, plus we're a little less than 275 square miles. And so that is for those, a few districts in the state, they do generate some numbers. If you're bigger than 275 square miles, and that's your school size, but you're less than 100 kids, ADM. So you have to have both to qualify. And then if you're really large, and I think there might be one or two, there aren't very many, that are bigger than 600 square miles, so that's a big district, 600 square miles, then less than 50 ADM. Then you get to generate another 1.1. And so that's what we have in law right now for isolated schools. Sometimes you hear isolated but necessary. That's what we have in law right now. You have to be bigger than this many square miles and then have ADM less. So you take all those factors on the right-hand side, you add all those up, and that is what goes into your next spot, which is waiting for school size, line 24. You get your total weighted average daily membership. Add lines 7 through 22. So what we just did, those calculations, that's going to add. So your line 24 is different than your line 7. Line 7 is your total kids, actual people. Lines 24 is the adjustments made it, and line 24 is going to be higher than line 7. Line 24 then is what is used to generate your revenue. So you take line 24, line 25, your school district size weighting factor. At Underwood, we're at a 1.24. In the bill that's going through the legislation right now, that adjustment is looking at increasing that for every school district that is less than 245 kids. So if you have less than 245 kids, you should see, if that passes the way it is right now, you should see an increase in that line 25 as we go forward. If you have more than 245 kids, there won't be any adjustment for that as of right now. So you take line 24 times line 25, get your total weighted student units. And again, the line 24 or 25, why that's there is because of efficiency and so forth. So let's just take line 24 times line 25, get line 26 to get your weighted student units. You take that times your line 27, which right now is 10,036, and when we're talking about 0 and 0, what we're meaning is the next 2 years, the way it's passed the House, it would continue to be 10,036. Now, if we have an opportunity, we're pushing, we're trying, we're seeing what we can do to get that increased to 1-1, which means it added 1%, which is about $100 on that number. If that would be possible, for every transition minimum school, and I want to stress this, you want to see that line 28 get as high as it can. Because that is the number that's going to be subtracted from where you're actually at. You'll see that when I look at our Underwood numbers. And so the 1%, if you're a transition minimum school, 1% is only going to help you, and that's going to make your subtraction less. It's kind of an oxymoron there, but that's what we want to look at. So transition minimum schools, we need to be pushing as well for that 1%. Because otherwise our cuts are going to be more. We're not going to see any new money, it's just going to make our deductions less. For those school districts that are on the formula, that would be an increase for them. And so it helps everybody. It's a win-win. So that's why we really want to push, and we really want to try to get the legislators to understand that it's so important for our funding formula to continue to have increases. And it's interesting, what's happening over the years is we have not been able to keep up with the rate of inflation. And so what's going on is slowly we're seeing our mills levy inching up. And it's because school districts have to do that to pay their teachers, so on and so forth. And so we really need to try to get some increases there on line 27. When I talk about transition minimum schools, and you'll see our example where you can see that and make sure you understand that, but just so you know where we're at statewide, there are 94 school districts across the state, so roughly a little more than half, that are transition minimum schools, and those 94 school districts generate an additional $49 million to those 94 school districts. Just so you have an understanding of how that works. I mean, there is some dollars that are associated with transition minimum schools. And I want to make sure you understand.
Okay, so at this point, we're gonna have you take what you just learned from Brant, and we're gonna actually have you pull your sheets, and even if you pencil it into your worksheet, we're gonna have you fill out now lines 1 through 28 on your worksheet. Focus group and ASA members, if you'll stand up and help me mill through the crowd and make sure everybody is really solid, ask any question you want. There is not a silly question at this point.
And it wouldn't be very hard just to use what Adam gave you as a great starting point. Because you just emailed that might be the easiest way to get you started. But that's a great way to get started, yes. I don't know if that works. Hands up, yeah. No, we don't do that. That's elementary. No offense to those that are elementary. Yeah. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. I did want to bring up a couple of things. We've got about 20 minutes before we're going to break for lunch, and so I just wanted to make sure, I know we might break a little bit earlier if we can get through there, but I did want to bring up, because I had a couple of questions that I want to make sure that we understand. And basically, this is the next section, and a lot of you have gone ahead to that section, and that's why you're here, because you're transition minimum. And I want to make sure that you understand where you can find out your transition minimum and what that amount is, and then explain what Adam did in his emails that he sent out. Because he kind of did some things in the background that I had a conversation with Adam, that's why I know that's what he did, but just to make sure you understand that. So, in our worksheet at Underwood, the next section, lines 29 through 34, is what determines that where I know that I am a transition minimum school. Line 29, transition maximum adjustment. Line 30, transition minimum from line 75, and we'll talk about that this afternoon. We're not going to get there this morning as far as where we came from. But if you have a dollar amount from this year's worksheet in the right-hand column, so at Underwood, we're a transition minimum amount of $345,000. That's how far our district is above the formula. So as you look at your spreadsheets, your worksheets, and your payments from Adam for this year, for 2020-21, if you have any dollar amount in line 30 on the right-hand side, you are a transition minimum school, and that is the amount that you're being paid above the formula. That's your amount of your transition payment. Okay? Now, when Adam did his new budget worksheets for the next 2 years, what he did in that line 30, he adjusted that for you already, because right now, the way 1388 passed the House, it's a 15% cut of that amount in year 1, an additional 15% in year 2. And so what he did is he took the numbers generated from up above to get the total transition minimum amount, and he took it times 0.85 for the first year, 85%, 15% cut. So he took it times 0.85. And then the second year, he took it times 0.7, an additional 15%. So when you look at your numbers on your worksheet that Adam sent you, that's what he did in the background. He didn't show any place to show that, but that's what he did. So make sure you understand. So that is the amount, line 30, that is going to go down. And the way it is written in law right now, and that was passed this last session, is 15%, an additional 15%, an additional 15%, all the way for 6 years. 6 times 15 is 90. Then year 7 will be 10%. That is what is in law right now. So if you have any dollar amount in the right-hand column, you will see that number go down over the next 7 years. Now, one of the things we're trying to do is, for transition minimum, is, I'm a math guy, and so it drives me nuts. It's like, well, why put the 10% at the end when you're almost there? Why not put it in year 1? So that's what we're going to try to do, put that in year 1 instead of year 7. So we have 10%, then 15%. So really it would give you an extra 5% the first year, which again isn't a lot, but it's something. So that's what we're trying to do. So I wanted to make sure we understand, because I get that question all the time. Well, how do I know if I'm a transition minimum school? Do you have anything in line 30 on the right-hand side? If you do, you are a transition minimum school. If you don't, then you're on the formula. Okay, so that's one test. And then the second thing is that question, once they find that, well, so that means that's going away? Yes. That dollar amount at Underwood, over 7 years, eventually I need to figure out my budget so that I can absorb that eventually $345,000 hit. For some of you, it's as much as 1.2 million. For some, it's whatever else. Question? There are a few unique districts that are transition maximum and transition minimums. I think there's 1 or 2, you might be in that situation. So if you have something in line 29, that's how much negative, how much you're not being paid that you should, and then number 30 is how much you're above, and so then they equal that out. So there are 1 or 2 districts where you have both. Unique situations.
So one thing, here's a trick. I talked to a few different tables about this. If you want to, you should have it, Adam should have given you or sent you your projections in a PDF, but also an Excel document. Okay? If you have that Excel document, go to File, and you can unprotect the worksheet. There are cells that you can't manipulate. You can't change the cells. If you unprotect the worksheet, you can. So for example, if you want to take everything that Adam gave you in a projection on the PDF and enter it into that Excel document, you could change then the foundation aid amount to the 1% over 2 years, and you'd see how that 1% change would impact your district. I would suggest that you do that. So you just go into File and Unprotect. The first column you'll see is Protect, Unprotect, and you want to unprotect that worksheet so you can change the frozen cells or the protected cells.
And the other thing that I mentioned before, I just want to reiterate here, that dollar amount, the $345,000, how they get that dollar amount is taken line 30 on the left-hand side minus whatever was up above. And so that's why we want to get the 1%. I mean, whatever we get on the base, we want to get that as high as we can because we're subtracting that amount out. And so if we can subtract a higher amount out, that's going to decrease this payment. And so that's why we want to put money on the base. Even if you're a transition minimum school, you like to see money put on the base. Again, I can't stress that enough because sometimes there could be that, woe is us, we're just going to see cuts. Well, yes, but we want to make those cuts as painless as we can. And so money on the base is going to help us. Plus, another way to look at it and think about it is, once we get on the formula, we want to fall as short of a distance as we can. We don't want to fall all the way down here, we want to fall where that number is going higher. So that's another way to look at it as well. So we really want to get money on the base, because that's going to help us long term. I think this would be a good place to stop at this point. This afternoon, just kind of give you kind of what we're going to be looking at this afternoon. So we'll continue to go through your worksheet, your budget sheets and so forth. We're going to talk about this afternoon where it comes into play, the 60 mil deduction, the in lieu of deductions. We'll take a look at your next section, your next part of your worksheet as far as where that comes into place. This afternoon, we'll also look at the part of the worksheet that can be a little bit confusing as far as your transition minimum, where that comes from. There's a whole section that determines what kind of helps you to see where those numbers come from, so we'll walk through that as well. Is there anything else before, because I know it's always good, I think, to get a little bit more than an hour to get eat and so forth, so. Anything else for the good of the order? I was going to want to raise your hand.
What's that?
You can leave your stuff here. It'll be safe. You can leave your stuff here. We will reconvene at 1 p.m. So be back here at 1 p.m. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you back at 1. We'll see an increase in weighting factors. And the way it's written right now, and I don't see this part changing a whole lot, but basically you go from potentially 1.25 to 1.72. And so that's a pretty big increase when you think about 0.5, 0.6 for every one of your kiddos. If you're a small school, that can generate quite a bit more dollars for you. And so it does increase, the smaller you get, the more of an increase you see. And it goes 1.72, 1.68, but basically if you look at this legislative piece of legislation that's out there, you can get an idea of where you will be at in 7 years. And so it's a good way just to kind of see where the end of the line is when you get on the formula, kind of do some of that math and figure out where you're going to end up. So again, I just wanted to kind of show that so you can see exactly where that is at and what those new weighting factors will be for school districts that are below 245.
So Brad, question, with the projections that Adam sent, do those have the increase if they're below 240?
Yes, as far as I know, Adam did put the increase, and then the other thing to realize that the changes, like for instance, I want to point this out too, the changes like from 1.25 to 1.72, that doesn't happen in 1 year. The way the bill reads, you take 1/7 of that difference and you slowly walk through that. So, and again, everything is in 7-year increments. So that way in 7 years, everyone gets on the formula. So if the difference is 0.5, you take 1, or 0.49 for easiest, in my mind, 0.07 will be the increase the first year. So Adam did have that in his worksheet the slowly increasing the amount of weighting factors that are there. Now, those that are close to that 200 to, close to that amount, you're not gonna see that for several years, because it's only 0.01 difference, and so you're not gonna really see that. But good question. All right, so we were on the equity adjustments, and basically we walked through and talked about the transition minimum and where you can see that, and make sure we understand where that comes from. And as we walk through the worksheet, we need to also talk about, in this next slide, we've already talked about it, if you're on the formula, off the formula, line 29 and 30, and so we've talked about this before. Yeah, so we can kind of just skip through this one. But formula adjustments, and this is the next part I want to talk about. So as you look at your second page of your worksheet, it's important to understand how this affects your payment from the state as well. And there's different sections, and I'll go through each one of these sections because depending upon where you're at, this could affect your payment. Section B, contribution from other local revenue, we call this your in lieu of. This is money that comes from your county. There's different ways that generates these dollars. Up here is my Underwood worksheet again. So you can see from our county, line 36, we get $140,000. At Underwood, that's mainly coal money. Now, at Underwood, we're concerned because as of right now, our coal plant that is right next door to our school district is scheduled to close in 2022. Depending on who you talk to, there's potential that maybe it'll be bought out and so forth. But that is a concern because we do get a portion, some of our money, and that's deducted at 75%. Again, the idea of equity. The state will subtract out 75% of that, and then now we'll be able to generate to all statewide. Tuition dollars, what that is made up of in Underwood for us, we have a preschool. We charge tuition for a preschool, so that's the major majority of what that dollars is. Flood, election generation, mobile home taxes, telecommunications, so forth. So you add all that up, and that is, once you take the 75%, for us at Underwood, $189,000. So as you look at your worksheet, you're going to have a number generated after line 70 or line 41. That is what's going to be subtracted from what was generated up above. So when you generate those total dollars, you take your ADM times your weighted factors, that's not what you get. That's your total amount of money to make you adequate, and realize that can be made up of your local dollars and some of these county money, so on and so forth. So that's the first subtraction, is your in lieu of your county, your in lieu of section.
So maybe the way to think about that is that number, your per pupil. So for Underwood, okay, so line 28. This is the amount that the state has determined is needed to adequately educate the students in your school district. That number is intended to be inclusive of state and your own local revenue. Okay, so there's going to be those local adjustments that come because it's intended to be your local as well as the state contribution. So this is what's needed to adequately educate the kids in your district.
And again, that's 2.74 million, but I actually get over 3 million because of the transition million. And so that's what happens there. So, but yeah, so that's the first subtraction is the contribution from local. That's what's going to be subtracted from your payment. And so in that situation, this is a year behind. And actually, I had a business manager out there say, "Well, I thought we were getting paid on time." Well, not for our county taxes and so forth, because that's always a year behind. You subtract out what comes from the year before. Now, this last session, we put this underneath S&I levy, total levy, non-S&I percentage. If you are a school district, S&I stands for sinking in interest. If you're a school district that have gone to a building project and your percentage is such, this will allow you to keep more than 75, or to keep more than 25%, not subtract the full 75% of your in lieu of. And so if you're a school district that hasn't had a building project, and this is a different percentage, that would allow you to keep some more of your county money. And so there might be a few districts that have some numbers here. At Underwood, we don't have a sinking interest levy, so it doesn't affect us. Some of you might. So that's the first deduction. Deduction of in lieu of. That's subtracted out. Now the second part has to do with contribution from property tax. And if you remember, one of the pre-assessment questions was, what does the state assume every school district is going to be able to levy? And the answer to that was 60. And this is where this gets figured in. So district taxable valuation. So line 42, that's how much taxable valuation is in your district. And that's going to be different for every district across the state. And so there could be a situation where for us at Underwood, our 60 mills generates $854,000. That's how much the state's going to subtract from the 60 mills. You might be in a situation where your taxable valuation, line 42, may be 10 million. And then you're not going to have as much of a subtraction. There could be a district out there, exact same size as Underwood, might be 20 million. Their subtraction is going to be more. So depending upon where your taxable valuation is going to determine how much the state's going to subtract with the 60 mills. And this is where this gets figured. So section C is where they figure out what the deduction is going to be, the 60 mills. Now they have some adjustments, and that's where line 45, 46, and 47 come into play, and that's what I had mentioned before. If you're below 60 mills, because your valuation has gone way up, this is where you're going to want to pay attention to this section. Because this basically, they're going to subtract that 12% plus to get you towards 60 mills. And so if you have anything in these lines, pay attention to that, because you then have the authority to levy that additional dollars. So there are some districts in the state, mainly on the western side, that have seen great increases in valuation due to oil, where they'll be able to levy more than 12% on their general fund, and the amount is determined in this section. That's what you're going to want to pay attention to. Because eventually, within, I think that part is 5 years, if I remember right, they want to get all districts up to 60 mills in taxable, in those levying 60 mills. So pay attention to that. Lines 49 through 52, that's something that affects school districts across the state, especially smaller rural districts. Ending fund balance. The larger districts, they usually don't have to worry about that because their budgets are such that the percentages, they're not even close to that. But basically, it takes your general fund ending balance, so this is the money in your general fund that you have left after last year. General fund expenditures, so your expenditures on your budget, that's what determines your ending fund balance, is your general fund expenditures, and they take 35% of that plus 50,000. They come up with a number, and then they compare those numbers. If you have more than 35% plus 20,000, they're going to reduce your payments by how much ever you're over that amount. So that's something you're really going to want to watch as you get towards the end, especially this year, because of some of the federal funds, so forth. You may be in a situation where that number, you're going to be coming up against that ending fund balance total. So really watch for it. There is some bills that are going through that some of that money is from impact aid. You don't have to count that. There is some thought process, especially if some of these ESSER funds come through, that we get a 2 or 4 year moratorium on that, meaning that they won't subtract any of that. Your ending fund balance can go over that amount. And so that, I think that'd be a great thing for transition minimum schools, and let us keep some of our own money to prepare for that. And so we're hoping that we can get some of that through. But that's a section. If you have anything in line 52, basically you have given back some money to the state that you would have coming to you. And so if you have anything in line 52, take a look at that. And as you come to the end of the year, there are some options there. So At this point, I'd say take a look at those sections B, C, and D, and we'll take 7 minutes, take a look at that. If you have any questions, and fill out the worksheet and budget and put those numbers in and so forth. So take a look at section B, C, and D in your worksheet, and we'll walk around focus group. And if you have questions on those 3 sections, just take a look at those and work with them. Things as I walk around, I will make sure I make clear. Line 47, and I saw this in a few different worksheets, and it doesn't affect us in Underwood, so I didn't point that out like I should have. If you have a dollar amount in line 47 on the right-hand side, if you have a dollar amount in line 47, that means you're below 60 mils, and that's the amount you can levy above your 12%. Because we levy in dollars. And so if you have anything in line 47 on the right-hand side, you can levy an increase of 12% plus whatever the dollar amount is in line 47. You have the authority to do that. And that's again to get you up to the 60 mils. If you don't have anything in line 47 like Underwood, don't worry about that. You're at 12%. But if you have something in line 47 on the right-hand side, that is the amount you can levy in addition to your 12%, because that's what they're going to subtract, whether you levy it or not. So make sure you realize that. Sometimes they get, well, if I don't levy it, they're not going to subtract it. They're going to subtract it. Whether you levy it or not, they're going to subtract it. So you might as well levy it. If the state could be subtracting 60 mils whether you levy it or not. It's only if the state is subtracting less than 60 you can have something like this. So the state's subtracting 60 mils whether you levy it or not. Yep. All right.
You're behind. It's always a year behind. Okay. The next section I'm going to go over is section F. Section E has to do with transportation, and that is something that I'll leave that up to you guys to work on your own miles and so forth. I didn't put that in here per se. That's totally up to each district, how many miles, how many bus routes, how many riders. I will mention this though. For the section on transportation, there is a bill that, so make sure you realize that as superintendents, business managers, if you go to a neighboring district to pick up kids, so in other words, if you have kids open enrolled from a neighboring district, right now there's a bill that's going through that says you cannot claim those miles that you go into a neighboring district. So make sure you realize that. So if you leave your own district, your district boundaries, and you pick up kids in another district, once you leave your district, you are not to claim those miles. So make sure you realize that. I'm saying you cannot get miles into a neighboring district. Now, leave it at that. But that is going through. The thought process is there that the state, as the state looks around, they don't like seeing 3 different buses going into the same community picking up kids, and they're saying, why are we paying for 3 different school districts to pick up kids from that school district? So, anyway, so that is, just to realize that might address might adjust your mileage a little bit as far as if you go into a neighboring district, don't count those miles. I'll leave it at that. Can you count the kids? That's a great question. In fact, we just talked about that at lunchtime here. We are trying to get it that we can still count the kids because no matter which bus they get on, the states would pay for them, whether they're on yours or a neighboring one. Right now, the way it's in the bill, it says, it makes it sound like you can't count the kids, but I'm saying, well, technically, if you go pick up somebody in another district, the way the law is written, you're not supposed to count the miles or the kids, but in the end, I'm just gonna say, you're riding every bus in your district. I'll say it, I'll leave it at that. But it is something that's they're asking for. So that is what's in there right now. So realize that in the mileage section. Okay, history of transition minimum, and that's again why most of you are here, because you're part of those 94 school districts that are transition minimum schools. Section F determines where those numbers come from. And so I just wanted to mention that so you can see, because again, that's the biggest question that I get asked all the time. How come we're transition minimum school? What's happened? And this section in your worksheet explains why you are transition minimum schools. So in 7 years, when everybody's on the formula, I fully expect this section to go away. You will not see this section in 7 years, because everyone will be on the formula. There's no need for this section.
Brad, do you want to talk maximums too?
Yes, maximum as well. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I always forget that. So transition maximum, there are 9 or so districts that are transition maximum schools, and a great point. When I talked about before lunch, as far as that right-hand column where Adam adjusted the 85%, he did that for transition maximum schools as well. So he already gave you that extra 15% back on that amount, so that's why it doesn't match the full 15%. So anyway, baseline funding, minimum and maximum payments. In line 65, your baseline funding is based on years 2018-19 state aid formula payments. Now, MLRG, that actually referenced something back 2012-13-14. It stands for Mill Levy Reduction Grants. There was a time in our funding formula where the state bought down from 175 mils down to 110. So it was grants up to 75 mils, so that's still technically in there. So state aid formula payment, mill levy reduction grant, general fund levies, and then the 75% and 100% in lieu of. So basically it takes a look at what kind of money was generated in your districts in 2018-19. Then it divides that total dollar amount by how many weighted student units you had in 2018-2019. For us in Underwood, when you do that calculation, we end up with $11,019.75. So in 2018-19, that's how much money we got per student. So wherever you are at, it will be a different dollar amount, but that number for school districts that are transition minimum is going to be above the 10,036. For those districts that are transition maximums, that's going to be below, well below the 10,036. And then there's a unique district where it's below the 10,036 and they're both transition minimum maximum. Again, it's unusual, but it has happened, it does happen. So that dollar amount is what basically that amount is how much more you're getting paid per student than if you were on the formula. The maximum increase amount, 110%. I think next year on your pay or worksheet that you got from Adam, it shows 115%. So that amount is going up. So basically, if you're a maximum school, they'll do a calculation, say this is the most money you could get. We're not going to pay you above that maximum amount. So if you're a transition maximum school, you get your payment reduced from the state because they're saying we're not going to give you your full amount that you should have coming to you. And again, with 1388, That is being adjusted, so in the next 7 years, eventually that will go away. We'll get the full amount. It's being increased 15% every year, the difference. If you're a minimum schools, line 69, over the last 2 years, we've seen an increase of 1%. So if your minimum is because of, and there's two different ways to get transition minimum. There's actually a dollar amount or per pupil, per student amount. For me in Underwood, I'm a dollar amount. So I get $11,1975, I get to take it times 1.02% because we got 1%, and that's what we're looking at there. And multiplying, I get $3.071 million. Now, line 70, I'll explain that. This last session, there was a bill that basically said any new students above your baseline amount are only going to generate the same amount no matter where you're at in the state. And so line 70, some of you have some in there, I don't. But if you have something in line 70, that means you've grown after your baseline, and that's going to generate some dollar amount at the 10,000 rate as compared to, in my case, the 11,000 rate. Okay? So take a look at those lines and see if you have anything in there. So line 71, then, if you had something in line 70, it would add it, and you'd have a larger amount. For me, I have the same as line 69. Baseline funding, I go back and I compare it to line 65 up above. And then whichever one is bigger, I take times percentage, 100% minimum funding amount. That is what determines the amount of transition minimum that you have. So it really goes back to 18, 19. For some, it actually goes back to 12, 13. Depends upon when you lost students, depends upon your middle levy reduction grant, depends upon your in lieu of, all those type of things gets figured into there. So each school district is different why their transition minimum amounts and so forth. That's probably the most tricky part of the worksheet is this section right here. And what as people start to figure this out, that 2% can throw you off as well. I had a couple of different districts that just the other day I was working with, and that 2%, because they hadn't figured that out, and it doesn't make a difference. So at Underwood, if you remember what Dr. Lex said, at Underwood, what the state says is that adequate education was about $2.8 million. Well, guess what? Because of all this, I get $3.1 million for 7 years adjusted until I get back at the farm. And so that's where your districts are at. That's the difference where you're at. So those are the challenges coming ahead.
So I like this slide. I think it gives us a good sense. Now, this assumes that you're on the formula, by the way. But one of the things that there's assumptions, especially with legislators and even some of our school board members, that we're getting $10,036 a kid. We are not. Nobody in here gets $10,036 per pupil. You don't get it. That's not how the formula works. Remember, the intention of the formula is to be inclusive of state and local revenue. And that 10,036 is a target for adequate education. So to determine, assuming you're on the formula, that what you actually receive in state aid is going to be different for every school district that's sitting in here. So if you look at Jamestown, we get 10,036 per pupil is the adequate calculation or the amount. If I calculate my state assumed local contribution, so the value of that 60 mils divided by per pupil, that's $17.75 that's essentially deducted from that $10,036. My contribution from other local revenues is really pretty minimal. So for me per pupil, that's $130. So I take those two deductions and I subtract them from my 10,036. The state actually pays me $81.31 a student. It's not 10,036. I'd encourage you to take a moment and do your own calculations and see what is it that you're actually receiving? Because it isn't 10,036. The formula is not designed to do that. But that's a misnomer. Even our legislators believe that to be the case. We give you 10,036 a kid. No, you don't. In some cases it's more. In some cases it's less. In some cases it's substantially less than 10,036. But I would do these calculations. I think it's valuable to have this and make sure that your boards are aware what you actually are receiving from the state, because it is not 10,036.
And this is where I talked about that second line, state assumed local contribution. If you don't levy 60 mills, they're gonna subtract that 60 mills whether you levy it or not. And so in your calculation, you can figure that out. And then that's basically your local property taxes. Are you levying those local property taxes to cover the amount they are subtracting? And that's important. The other thing is the actual state for payment to Jamestown, 8,100. So really, as you look at their numbers, 81% of their revenue comes from the state. That's another way to look at that. For some of you, as you do your numbers, you might come up with about 6,500 or whatever. I mean, it depends upon where your situation, then you'd be at 65%. So each district is going to be different what that amount is.
When you did this calculation, so when I'm looking at what I'm receiving, did you do your weighted?
I didn't wait anything.
We wanted to put this slide in there just to kind of, we've talked a lot about this as far as how it's affecting the funding formula. And, but I wanted to point out exactly what 1388, what it's looking at. Again, we talked about increased weighting factors for if you're less than 245. If you are a K6, I know we have some K6, K8 schools in here, so I want to talk about that a little bit. If you are a K6, K8 schools, what 1388 does is it gets you onto the formula by giving you a formula payment. And how it does that, you divide your ADM by 0.6. And so that factor, what that is saying, if you were a K-12 school, how many kids would you have? So when you divide by 0.6, it gives you more students. That would be, in theory, what you'd have if you were a full K-12. And then you go to the chart that I showed right at the beginning of the afternoon. That chart will tell you what your weighting factor would be. And then there's some, right now, the way it passed the House, there's a deduction to saying we're going to multiply that by 0.92. The thought process is K6, K8s, you can run those more efficiently than you can in high school. Because you don't have as many teachers, you don't have to have specialized, you have one teacher per grade, so on and so forth. So that is what's in law right now. Multiply the weighting factor determined by these numbers by 0.92. That is something we are looking at because the larger K6, K8 schools, those schools that are more than 150 kids, it actually drops from where they're at right now, so we're looking at that right now. 1388 keeps per pupil payment at 10,036. That's what we're talking about, the 0-0. Keeps that for 2 years. If we can get that 1%, that would increase that to 10,134, and then think 10,232 or something like that. Adjusted transition maximum school districts and increases their payments to get them on the formula in 7 years. So if you're a transition maximum, 1388 does get you on the formula, gets you your full payment within 7 years. On-time funding increases by 10% each year, so it goes from 50 to 60 to 70 to 80 to 90 to get you the students that you have show up and get paid for them. And it keeps the adjustments to get all school districts up to 60 mills. So if you're under 60 mills, it doesn't adjust that at all. So it's still going to get you up to 60 mills. So those are what 1388 is doing right now.
Okay, so we wanted to, so some of this for some of you or many of you is going to be really pretty basic, but we have new folks to the state, we have new people to new positions, so we want to take time and provide a little primer on local taxation, how we determine that local contribution. So taxable land in your district is going to fall into one of 4 categories: residential, agricultural, centrally assessed properties, things like pipelines, and agricultural land. So for the first 3, residential, commercial, and centrally assessed, that's all done based on market value. Agricultural land is different. That's done through an NDSU formula, and that is looking at a span, a rolling span of 10 years. Takes out the high, takes out the low, averages the remaining 8 years. Okay? So that's the taxable, that's the categories of land that you're going to have that you need to consider. So in terms of how you calculate taxable value, you're going to take the market value, take it in half. You multiply it by 50% of your market value to get your assessed value. You take that assessed value and you multiply it times 9 or 10%, depending on what type of land you're looking at, for commercial and residential. And when you look at your taxable value in your district, that is the accumulation of each of these individual properties and what their individual taxable value is. So your school districts, and in my school district is 78 million, that's all of the land all the taxable land in Jamestown, the accumulation of this particular calculation. It's just done on a larger scale.
And some of your districts span more than one county, and my advice I always give to new superintendents and superintendents through the state, get to know your county auditors in every county that you have land in. You're gonna wanna develop a relationship with them, because that's where those numbers come from, and that can help you as you get, if things don't look right, you wanna give them a call. So that is accumulation of all land and all counties put together, depending on how many counties you have that are in your district.
So the example is, and this was one of our pre-assessment questions, I asked you what the taxable value would be on a home valued at $100,000, and this is the process. You have a home at the market value of $100,000. We know that we take it in half, multiply it by 50% to get its assessed value, so that its assessed value is $50,000. It's a residential property, so you take it by 9%, that comes to $4,500. That's how we get to that taxable value for that residential property. Okay, again, that's the accumulation of all the homes, all the taxable land that's in your district or multiple counties, including multiple counties. So now a quick check for you. If that's the process, assessed value times 9 or 10%, depending on what type of property it is. Now I want you to figure the taxable value of a residence, so you're using the residential 9%, with a market value of $275,000. So what would the taxable value be for that particular property? Okay, so we know all the factors we need to know. The taxable value is $275,000. We take it in half, $137,500. We take that by 9%. That's $12,375. So the taxable value for that property is $12,375. So if we know the taxable value, the next calculation that we need to consider is what is a mill. A mill is 1/10 of a penny. Right? It's going to generate revenue equivalent to 0.001 of your taxable value. An example, the easiest way, if you look at your own taxable value in your district, you can determine how many mills or how many dollars that generates per mill just by taking the last three numbers off. So if it's 50 million, we know that each mill is going to generate $50,000. Another quick check for you. So if that's what we know, assume your district has a taxable value of 15 million, and you wish to increase, like I said, show you the whole process there. It wishes to increase 5 mills in your miscellaneous levy. How much new revenue does that generate? So I want you to figure that, even though I show you it right there, I still want you to figure it out on your own. Use that as your guide. Again, just move your decimal place over 3 spots. You take it times the number of mills.
And I don't know, Dr. Leck might have said this, so forgive me if he has, because I was talking to him, but miscellaneous mills, that's up to 12, that is not subject to the 12%. So if you do not levy your 12 miscellaneous mills, your board has full authority to levy that at any point, apart from the 12%. It has no part of the 12%.
Yep, you can go from 12, you can go from 0 to 12, down to 6, down to 2, down back to 12 in successive years. It doesn't impact that 12%.
And miscellaneous levy it says that, it's miscellaneous. Basically, I was put in place that there were some other levies that they have board and authority for. So you can use that pretty much on anything. There are some stipulations, business managers that are here, there are some places they're supposed to keep track of it and so forth, but it is pretty open to what you can use those miscellaneous meals for. So that is one place that if you're a transition minimum school and you're struggling to see how you're going to make the numbers work, if you don't levy any miscellaneous meals, there's an opportunity for that. What's your miscellaneous mills?
So a little history again behind the miscellaneous levy. It used to be, as Brant referenced, we used to be able to go to our public and with a 50% approval, we were able to get a couple of different types of levies. Things like transportation, you could levy for transportation, you could levy for 5 mils for technology, for asbestos. There was a bunch of them. And when the legislature went through the second iteration of the funding formula, they said that no school levied over 12 in these, what they consider these miscellaneous levies. So that's why they made it 12. So you do have that authority to be able to go from 0 to 12 and back up and down, just as you would in other levies that are not the general fund. So we wanted to also walk through the different type of levies that you might see in your district. The general fund, of course, we're awfully familiar with. The state assumes that levy of 60 mils because that's what's deducted. Legislators don't like it when we call it a state levy, but that's essentially, in my opinion, what it is. Because the state deducts it, it's their levy. But that's deducted from your foundation aid payment in those adjustments, as Brand's talked about. You can levy up to 70 mils in your general fund without a vote of the people. You have those, what they call board discretionary mills between 60 and 70. If you are unable to levy the full 60, your deduction is what you can levy. So if, because your taxable value is increasing beyond that 12%, and you are only able to levy in a year 56 mils, they're going to deduct you 56 mils.
That's that line 47 that I talked about before, is what Dr. Mack was talking about.
So you might look at your foundation aid worksheet, and it actually says 56 or 58.7, or in some cases 30. It's very low for some. But that's the maximum that you can be deducted. Not everybody can get to 60. There are schools that have seen substantial growth, taxable value growth. They're below that. That's particularly schools that are out in the west, in particular. But they might be capped at 38 mils. So they get deducted at that amount.
The other thing I wanted to talk about here, because it's close, I mean, if the coal plant next to Underwood closes, I could have this very well happen to me. If the taxable valuation goes down, you might be in a situation where you can always levy the same amount of dollars you did the year before. And so if your taxable valuation goes down, you might be in a situation where you can levy more than 70 mils. I know that's happened to a few districts, so realize that. Because it's based on the year before, but you can always tax the same amount of dollars. So if that dollars is more than 70 mils, you're still okay. Don't worry about it. Because you can always levy the same amount of dollars as you did the year before, even if it gets you above the 70 mils. So if you're in a district where you know you might have some tax valuations going down, realize you won't be able to get the 12% higher unless you have room in your 70 mils. But if you're up against that 70 mils, just realize you can always get the dollars you did the year before.
So you might also be looking at a special reserve levy if you don't have that. So districts can levy up to 3 mils every year, put it in a special reserve. It's almost like an emergency fund. There are limitations, but by an action of the board, you can take out half of the value. So essentially, if you think of it in a perpetual way, you're basically levying 3 mils and you're able to pull 1.5 out.
I like to say this, you're creating your own legacy fund. You're setting aside money for the future rainy days.
You have special assessment levy. You should be notified of your special assessments from your city or county. That is going to pay things like your light poles and your sidewalks, things like that. You can only levy in your special assessments what you are assessed. It can't be more. It can be what you levy or what you need to pay that special assessment. The building fund has a cap at 20, but you need authority to levy. Somewhere, if you're levying at a building fund in your district, somewhere in the history of time, you have been given authority to do that, and those minutes should tell you how much.
I had that question earlier that happened to me in Underwood. we levy an amount, it's like, when did that start? We look back, our business manager had to go back to minutes to 1957, I believe, is when it was voted in. So it's sometimes hard to find, but basically you have to go back and find when that vote happened and find out what amount you were able to levy up to. And then look around the minutes around that time. And so it can be a hard process to find. But you do need to know exactly what your voters had adopted, whether it be in 1957 or 2007. It totally depends.
And you might have had a reorganization plan that establishes what your building fund is, but that can be, as Brant said, really very tricky. You're going to have precedents that tells you how much you've levied since, you know, the 60s, or, you know, you'll be able to get a range, but don't assume you can do to 20. The most typically, school districts across the state, the most common is 10. Then it goes to 5, then it goes to 20. You know, and I'm sure there's a smattering of others, but if you're levying, you need to make sure that you have authority to be at that level. And if you want to increase what has been precedence, I would be very cautious unless you can provide evidence that you've been given voter authority to do that. And now you could always take it back with a vote to the people to establish what that building fund is, what that amount is, but that's something you should have in minutes somewhere and be able to provide evidence for.
And the building fund, is that just a 50% or 60% vote?
I think it's 50, but I have to look. I had that question too.
Is it?
I think it's 50. Steve, you know? I'm pretty sure it's 50. 50?
64. Yeah. On your slide it says 60. I think it is 60. I think I need to increase.
I'd have to go.
It might be there.
It's been a decade since I did this initial presentation. So.
I believe it's 60, we just did it a couple years ago.
Okay.
It is 60. Okay.
Thank you.
Because I think any increase, as a rule of thumb, any increases in any amount to increase taxes to your taxpayers, it usually isn't 60%. So it's kind of a rule of thumb.
The last one I'm going to talk about, sinking in interest, used to pay for principal, premium, and interest payments when constructing, purchasing, or remodeling a facility. Of course, we know that this is 60%. We can like that and dislike that it's 60%, but that's what it is. It's a high bar for that increase. And that can be at a regular or it can be at a special election. Just depends on what works in your district. So one of the things that's interesting about this, and you'll see this, is that you're going to have to levy at 110%. Now the reason that is because not everybody pays their taxes on time. You know, I know that surprises a lot of business managers here, but not everybody pays their taxes on time. And so they ask for 110%. And at the end of that bond, when that bond is matured, the difference needs to be transferred into your general fund within 2 years. Is it 2 years or 3 years? I think it's 2 years. So that's something, if you are in that situation, that you're going to have to think about. But that's why it's 110%. And sometimes people ask that question: why are you know, if it's a project worth valued at $20 million, why are you requesting more than that? We're required to. And that they ask the question, well, why are you transferring it into the general fund when this bond's paid? Why are we taking it? We have to. It's required in Century Code to do so.
And that's where some of those unique questions, whether it's 2 years or 3 years and so forth, if you find a law that's in the first place. But Adam Teschers are always very good about answering some of those unique type of questions. The other thing I wanted to mention, the 60%, I have a brother that's in education in Idaho, and there it takes 67%. So it totally depends upon the state how high of a bar they have. And so,
Yeah, sounds 50.
yeah, there's some as low as 50, so it totally depends upon what state you're in.
So it's a real simple way to look at your district mill levy calculation. In this district, this fictitious district that has levied 92.65, that total levy amount would generate $4.6 million, and I'll just give you the chance to review that.
And as you're reviewing that, again, the rule of thumb, whatever your taxable valuation is, just move the decimal 3 places. That's what 1 mill is going to generate. That's always a good figure to have and to tell your board as you look at your budgets and so forth. what does 1 mil generate? Because if you're looking at the special reserve, let's say you don't have any special reserve, you might want to say, well, what are those 3 mils going to generate? Well, take your taxable valuation, move the decimal place 3 places. So like for my situation, Underwood, 14,000, those 3 mils would generate 42,000 of revenue for me. That's how you do it. So it's always a good thing to kind of think through some of those type of things. And that's what this example is showing, is making sure you understand how to do that.
So you talked already about 12% growth capital, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Just again, you hear this from legislators too, we're supposed to levy in dollars, not mills, it's mystical mills, but it really is, it's the 12% is in dollars. So we take what you levied last year, if you want to know your max, take it times 1.12. That's how you do it. Multiplied by 1.12. So 12% in dollars. This, we just want to make sure, you know, our funding formula is based on taxes. So it's not a bad idea to look up laws concerning taxes and follow that a little bit. Every session, this session is no different. There are laws that get introduced that say we want to limit you from 12% to 3% or 0%. In fact, there was a law that was introduced this session that said if you increase anything, you have to go to the vote of the people to increase your budget. That gets introduced every session. Every session I stand up and say, not so quick for funding formulas. That's going to create issues and heartaches and whatever else. So just realize that that's what I hear from legislators. That's their biggest concern is we pay too much property tax. And I think it goes back to what I said this morning. You know what you pay in property tax. Tell me what you pay in sales tax. Okay, then let's talk. Finance facts, every year there's some finance facts, so if you got this, there's a live link in there, you can look at every district to see what they levy and taxable valuation, all kinds of good stuff on here, so put you that. It's interesting because we update this every year, and as I looked at the new finance facts, these numbers, like I said before, are slowly creeping up. So that statewide average for the general fund is 68.67 mils, that's the average. Take a look at everybody, whatever else. But there are 45 or 26% that are levying below the 60 mils. So I know some of you are in here that are below the 60 mils, so you would be part of those 45. The districts that levied last year, 36% are levying 68 mils or higher in the general fund. Again, you're capped at 70. Now there's some special cases. Fargo has the authority to levy up to 120 mils in the general fund, whatever. That's a different situation, but. And then which includes 37 that are at or exceed the general fund cap. So 21%, and I know there's transition minimum schools that are at the max, they're at the 70 mils. You're not going to get any relief finding any revenue in the general fund. So then you're going to have to look at your miscellaneous funds, you're going to have to look at your special reserve fund. Every school district has the authority to go to the vote of the people and say, we want to get extra funds because we can't do it with the 70 mils. You have that right to do that. You have to specify a certain amount of years. Where's Edmore? I know 10 years. 10 years, and after 10 years, you have to go to vote of the people again. So if you're a transition minimum school and you're in the choice, and sometimes it happens. If you're a real small school, that's what happened in Edmore's situation. A real small school, they went to the vote of the people and they say, either we're going to have to levy more or close our school. Okay, we'll vote yes or levy. So there is that opportunity, possibility there for school districts. Statewide average 2021 was 103.13 mils. So if you look at your mills, kind of to see where you're at compared to the average, it is interesting. Some transition minimum schools are real low, and that's legislators say we don't have much sympathy for you because you're real low. Just to realize, they do look at that.
If you haven't had a chance to look at finance facts, if it's whether you're new to your position or whether you just have never looked, I really encourage you to take a look in there. Decades worth of information if you want to really play around and see trends and see what's happening. As Brant said, that general fund average, I think 5 or 6 years ago was right at 61. So it's creeping up to that cap where we're all going to be even more dependent on the state than we already are. And we see what happens when we're dependent and we're seeing 0% or 1%. It gets to be a real challenge. But I would encourage everybody here to spend a little bit of time in finance facts and poke around in there and see what it is that you see and trends that you can see. It's an educational time that you'll spend. If you do a maintenance of effort report for your board, that would be a good place to look for that information.
And the reason why it's creeping up again is we have not kept up with inflation. I mean, you think of 0, 0, you're not keeping up with inflation. 1, 1, you're not keeping up with inflation. We had 2 years where 0, 0. Yet on the flip side, we're fortunate in education that we have some of these other funds because there are other state entities that took cuts those real tough years. So I want to try to balance that because in education, legislators and the state has treated us, I would say, fairly. I mean, they have not made us take the 10 to 15% cut that they did other state agencies. So make sure you balance that when you communicate.
Yeah, we have that constitutional foundation aid stabilization fund that protects us. Anything else you wanted to talk about in some balance?
Just that again, this is something that hopefully we can give a little little time where we won't have to subtract that because of the ESSER funds and so forth. I mean, that would help some districts transition minimum. So that's another way we're trying to help those districts.
So really, that is the presentation that we have. If there are burning questions from anybody, I know we've kind of given you the drink from the fire hose philosophy of just throwing a lot of information at Brandon.
Rob, when you actually did that Jamestown example, where we did
Yep.
and then you subtracted that 60 mil offset there.
Yep.
If I do that way, like line 44 then, the contribution tax, property tax, that 60 mil, and divide that by, the line, line 24.
Your minimum school too, that is.
If we had a discussion to use ADM or weighted student units, it really doesn't matter. Just be consistent along the whole thing because they use the same one for all the different calculations, but it really doesn't matter which
I
one
think
of those
you
you
can
use.
make the case either way because it's an adequacy and equitable weighted student unit amount, or you're doing straight pupil. You know, how many butts are in seats. I don't think it matters. We've gone back and forth with what we've used, to be honest, but I don't think it makes a difference either way. Yeah.
Yeah, so the equity piece of that is the fact that the state subtracts 60 mils of that, whether it's 19,000, 190,000. I mean, it depends upon where you're at. So that's where the equity piece comes into play, is that they're going to subtract a local effort of 60 mils no matter what your tax evaluation. So, you know, some districts it ends up being, in Jamestown's situation, it's roughly 20% they subtract. In places where your tax evaluation is high for the number of students, they might be subtracting 50%. And so then you only get 50% from the state. So that's where the equity comes in, the different sizes of the boxes, that some boxes are lower than others because the amount they subtract, they expect the locals to make up that difference.
But then when you take it between the 60 mil and the 70 mil, where there's not a deduction, I think that's where
So that's the local control piece that you still have. You still have control of the mills that exist between 60 and 70 mills.
But I know what you're saying, and what you're saying is right. Those 10 mills are going to generate the same differences as well. So
Yeah.
if you're a wealthy school district, in a sense, you have a lot of good tax evaluation, you have more wiggle room in your budget. There is that reality. And it's also that reality when you go to, like Amanda was up this morning talking about, you know, building a high school. They have to generate more mills to fund the payments for that than right across the river to Bismarck. Because one mill in Bismarck generates a whole lot more in Bismarck than does in Mandan. And so far in their funding formula, they have not touched any of that thought process. But you are right.
Yeah, and really what the formula is trying to do is minimize that difference. You know, to not completely negate it, it's trying to minimize it.
It still gives you local control. There's still some benefits in those type of things. Great question, great thought.
Other questions? So if you're like me and you think of that great question, just as you turn the key to your car. You can always call Brent or myself, really any member of the focus group. You take our picture, give us a call anytime. We're happy to share the little knowledge that we have to try to help others.
Just one more. So the projection we got from state that a lot of us brought here, does that include like his guesses on what the final legislature is going to do in HB 1388?
No, it's the House version.
Yeah. It's based on the House version. That's what.
Based on the House version right
Yes.
now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
So that still could get tweaked, and he also makes some assumptions as far as tax valuation, those type of things, which affects your numbers as well. Because he doesn't have those numbers, he won't have those numbers, so he just makes the assumption and carries forward with what you have.
And that's why I suggest you take the Excel document and unprotect it and make changes as it goes along. That'll be helpful for you. Other questions?
And I will say this, transition minimum schools, it is a challenge, and as I look out across and talk to several of you, I know it's a challenge ahead, and I don't want to take that lightly. That's why I put my numbers, we're in there as well in Underwood, so it's a challenge that we have facing us, and you know, we know you guys can do it, and we'll have to do it, we don't have any choice, we'll make it happen. Good luck, thank you for being here. If you have any questions, feel free to ask us.
All right, thanks. Thanks again. Thanks, guys.